The morning sun struggled to pierce the heavy mist that clung to the rolling fields of western France on that fateful day in September 1356. Thousands of men stood in eerie silence amidst the vineyards and woods of Maupertuis, just south of the city of Poitiers. The air was cold and damp, but the soldiers, sweating under their heavy chainmail and plate armor, felt only the heat of anticipation. On one side, the massive host of the French King John II was arrayed in all its feudal splendor, with banners waving and horses pawing the ground. Opposing them was a smaller and bedraggled force of English and Gascon troops, led by the eldest son of the English king, who was cornered and far from home. This was not merely a border skirmish or a raid for plunder, but a moment that would define the balance of power in Europe for generations. The 100 Years' War had been raging for 2 decades, and the Kingdom of France was desperate to drive the English invaders into the sea. King John II commanded the resources of the wealthiest nation in Christendom, and he had gathered the flower of French chivalry to crush his enemies once and for all. For the English, the stakes were absolute and terrifyingly simple, because defeat meant total annihilation. They were deep in enemy territory with no hope of reinforcement, and their only path to safety lay through the massive French army blocking their retreat. At the center of the English line stood a figure who would become a legend in the annals of military history, known to posterity as the Black Prince. Edward of Woodstock was the Prince of Wales and the eldest son of King Edward III, and he was a warrior of frightening competence. Though he was only 26 years old, he had already proven his mettle 10 years earlier at the Battle of Crécy, where he commanded the vanguard. He was a man who understood the brutal realities of war better than the romantic ideals of chivalry. Edward knew that his outnumbered army could not match the French in a direct contest of strength, so he had to rely on discipline and terrain. The question that hung heavy in the air was whether a tired and hungry force of 6,000 men could withstand the assault of nearly 20,000 French soldiers. The French army included the greatest knights of the realm, who were eager to prove their valor and wash away the shame of previous defeats. Military wisdom of the time dictated that heavy cavalry was the supreme force on the battlefield, and the French had the finest cavalry in the world. Could the English longbowmen with their simple yew staves really stop the armored might of a kingdom? The odds seemed impossibly skewed in favor of King John II and his vast host of nobles. Edward of Woodstock had spent weeks leading a chevauchée, or a great raid, through the heart of France, burning villages and seizing loot to damage the French economy. His army was weighed down by wagons filled with plunder which had slowed their march and allowed the French king to outmaneuver them. Now that they were trapped, Edward ordered his men to take up a defensive position on a slope surrounded by thick hedges and vineyards. This terrain was chosen with cold calculation to negate the advantage of the French numbers and funnel the attackers into a narrow kill zone. The prince dismounted his knights and men-at-arms, ordering them to fight on foot alongside the archers. The weapon that would decide the fate of the day was the English warbow, which was a piece of technology that terrified the aristocracy of Europe. Carved from a single piece of yew wood and requiring immense strength to draw, these bows could loose arrows with enough force to penetrate mail and plate armor. The archers were not noble knights, but common men who had trained since childhood to develop the massive musculature needed to use the weapon effectively. They stood in formation on the flanks of the English line, with their arrows stuck into the ground before them, ready to unleash a storm of death. They were the great equalizer in a society dominated by the wealthy elite. King John II of France was a brave and honorable man who was deeply committed to the code of chivalry, but he lacked the tactical flexibility of his opponent. He was advised by his generals to starve the English out or to use his superior numbers to surround them, but he yearned for a glorious victory. The king believed that a direct assault would shatter the English morale and prove the superiority of French arms. He organized his army into 4 great divisions or battles and prepared to launch them in waves against the English position. He was confident that sheer weight of numbers and the courage of his knights would carry the day. Before the slaughter could commence, there was a brief and surreal interlude of diplomacy led by Cardinal Talleyrand de Perigord. The cardinal rode back and forth between the 2 armies throughout the Sunday before the battle, trying to broker a truce to avoid the shedding of Christian blood. Edward of Woodstock was willing to negotiate and offered to return all the towns and castles he had captured and to pay a heavy ransom. He even offered to pledge not to bear arms against France for 7 years in exchange for safe passage home. However, King John II demanded that the prince surrender himself as a prisoner, which was a condition Edward rejected outright. When the negotiations finally collapsed on Monday morning, the 19th of September, the time for talking was over and the time for dying had begun. The English used the delay to strengthen their position by digging trenches and reinforcing the hedges to create obstacles for the French horses. Edward walked among his men, offering words of encouragement and reminding them that their survival depended on their unity. He placed his trust in the Earl of Warwick and the Earl of Salisbury to hold the front lines while he commanded the reserve. The archers checked their bowstrings, and the men-at-arms tightened their grip on their poleaxes and swords. The battle opened with a thunderous charge by a select group of 300 elite French knights known as the Marshals of France. Their mission was to smash through the English archers and clear the way for the main body of the army to advance. They thundered up the slope with lances lowered and shields raised, expecting the peasants to scatter before them in terror. But the English archers held their ground and waited until the horses were within lethal range before drawing their bows. A sudden whistling sound filled the air as thousands of white-fletched arrows arced into the sky and rained down upon the charging knights. The effect of the arrow storm was immediate and catastrophic for the French cavalry, as the horses were maddened with pain. While the plate armor of the knights offered some protection against the arrows, the horses were vulnerable, and they reared and bucked in agony. The formation broke apart as wounded animals trampled their riders and careened into the hedges, throwing the charge into chaos. The narrow lane that led to the English position became a choke point filled with flailing bodies and screaming men. The English men-at-arms stepped forward to finish off the fallen knights with daggers and swords, turning the elite vanguard into a ruin. Witnessing the disaster of the first charge, the next division of the French army, led by the Dauphin Charles, began its advance on foot. King John had ordered his knights to dismount, believing that fighting on foot would negate the advantage of the English arrows against horses. The Dauphin was the heir to the French throne, and his division contained thousands of men at arms eager to engage the English. They marched up the slope under a hail of arrows, their heads lowered against the deadly rain. The English archers exhausted their supply of arrows, and some even ran out into the field to pull bolts from dead bodies. The clash between the division of the Dauphin and the English line was brutal and intense, involving hand-to-hand combat with heavy weapons. The sound of steel striking steel rang out across the valley as the two sides hacked and thrust at one another in a desperate struggle. The English line bent under the weight of the French numbers, but it did not break thanks to the discipline of the veterans. Edward sent reinforcements from his reserve to bolster the wavering sections of the line, ensuring the defense held firm. After hours of grueling combat, the French forces began to tire, and their momentum stalled against the solid wall of English resistance. Seeing that they could not break through and fearing for the safety of the heir to the throne, the advisors of the Dauphin ordered a retreat. The withdrawal of such a large force caused confusion and panic among the other French divisions waiting in the rear. The Duke of Orleans, who commanded the next line of battle, saw the Dauphin retreating and assumed the battle was lost. In a shameful display that would tarnish his reputation, forever, the Duke turned his division around and fled the field without striking a single blow. The departure of these fresh troops was a devastating blow to the French cause and left the king isolated. King John II watched in horror as a significant portion of his army melted away, but he refused to retreat and dishonor his crown. He ordered his own division, which was the largest and best equipped, to advance up the slope to crush the weary English. The sight of the royal standard of France advancing with the king himself in the front rank was a terrifying prospect for the exhausted English. Edward of Woodstock saw the massive force approaching and knew that his men were at the limit of their endurance. He ordered his men to mount their horses for a final desperate charge to meet the French king head-on. The Black Prince made a bold tactical decision to send a small cavalry force under the Capital de Butch to circle around the French flank. This maneuver was a gamble that would leave his main line thinner, but it was the only way to break the French formation. As the main English force clashed with the division of King John, the roar of battle reached a fever pitch. The English archers, who were now out of arrows, joined the melee with swords and axes, fighting side by side with the knights. The combat was fierce and bloody, with no quarter asked or given by either side in the crush. Just as the English line seemed on the verge of collapsing from sheer exhaustion, the banner of the capital de Butch appeared in the French rear. The sudden appearance of English cavalry behind them caused panic to ripple through the ranks of the French army. Caught between the hammer of the prince and the anvil of the capital, the French formation began to disintegrate. Men who had fought bravely moments before now threw down their weapons and tried to flee the encirclement. The English, sensing victory, surged forward with renewed energy and cut down the fleeing Frenchmen in droves. In the center of the swirling melee, King John II fought with the courage of a lion wielding a heavy battle axe. He was surrounded by his personal guard and his youngest son Philip, who stood by his side shouting warnings to his father. The king refused to yield even as his protectors fell one by one around him, and the English closed in from all sides. He struck down anyone who came within reach of his axe, determined to fight to the bitter end. It was a display of personal valor that earned him the respect of his enemies, even as his army collapsed around him. The chaos of the battlefield made it difficult to identify the king amidst the mud and blood and the press of bodies. Dozens of English and Gascon knights shouted at him to surrender, eager to claim the massive ransom a king would bring. Finally overwhelmed by numbers and realizing that further resistance was futile, King John handed his glove to a knight. The capture of the French king was the crowning moment of the English victory and a catastrophe for France. The news of his capture spread quickly across the battlefield, ending the remaining resistance and turning the retreat into a rout. The aftermath of the battle was a scene of utter devastation for the French nobility, with thousands lying dead or wounded on the field. The English had captured not only the king, but also his son and hundreds of counts, barons, and knights. The flower of French chivalry had been cut down by a smaller force of commoners and determined soldiers led by a brilliant tactician. The English army, which had been on the brink of destruction just hours before, was now master of the field. They had achieved one of the most lopsided victories in the history of medieval warfare. The English soldiers could scarcely believe their fortune as they looted the rich baggage train of the French army. They found gold, silver, jewels, and fine armor in quantities that would make many of them wealthy for life. The Black Prince treated his royal prisoner with great courtesy, serving him dinner that evening in his own tent. This act of chivalry contrasted sharply with the brutality of the battle and the harsh reality of the political situation. France was now a kingdom without a head, plunging the nation into chaos and civil strife. The Battle of Poitiers shattered the reputation of the French military and cemented the dominance of the English longbow. It proved that well-trained infantry and archers could defeat the finest heavy cavalry in Europe if they used terrain effectively. The age of the invincible mounted knight was beginning to fade, giving way to more professional and tactical armies. The victory also greatly enhanced the legend of the Black Prince, who was now seen as the greatest warrior of his age. His name became a byword for martial prowess and terror across the entirety of France. For France, the consequences of the defeat were immediate and disastrous, leading to the peasant revolt known as the Jacquerie. The heavy taxes needed to pay the ransom of the king and the perceived incompetence of the nobility sparked a violent uprising. The country descended into anarchy as mercenary bands roamed the countryside, pillaging and burning without restraint. The authority of the French crown was almost completely eroded, leaving the Dauphin to struggle to hold the kingdom together. It would take years for France to recover from the loss of its king and its army. The ransom for King John II was eventually set at an astronomical 3 million gold crowns, a sum that crippled the French economy. The Treaty of Bretigny, which followed the battle, forced France to cede vast territories to the English crown. Edward III effectively regained the Angevin Empire that his ancestors had lost, controlling nearly a third of France. The victory at Poitiers seemed to bring the English close to winning the 100 Years' War entirely. However, the war would drag on for another century, fueled by the enduring enmity between the two nations. The English longbowmen returned home as heroes, their status in society elevated by their crucial role in the victory. The yeoman archer became a symbol of English strength and independence, celebrated in songs and stories. The government continued to encourage archery practice, mandating it by law and banning other sports to ensure a supply of bowmen. The bow remained the dominant weapon of the English armies for another century, until the advent of gunpowder artillery. The legacy of Poitiers lived on in the military traditions of England for generations. Edward the Black Prince did not live to succeed his father as king, dying of dysentery 1 year before Edward III passed away. His tragic early death left the throne to his young son Richard II, which led to a period of instability in England. Despite his premature end, the Black Prince remains one of the most iconic figures of the Middle Ages. His tomb in Canterbury Cathedral displays his effigy in full armor, capturing the image of the warrior prince for eternity. He is remembered not as a king, but as the victor of Poitiers and the master of the battlefield. The tactical lessons of Poitiers were studied by military commanders for centuries as a masterclass in defensive warfare. The use of terrain to funnel the enemy and the coordination between infantry and archers became standard doctrine. It demonstrated that a smaller disciplined force could overcome a larger disorganized one through superior leadership. The battle marked a shift from the individualistic heroism of feudal warfare to the organized tactics of professional armies. It was a turning point in the evolution of military science in the Western world. King John II eventually returned to France to raise his ransom, but when one of his hostage sons escaped, he voluntarily returned to captivity. He died in London in 1364, displaying a commitment to honor that baffled many of his contemporaries. His reign is often remembered for the disaster at Poitiers, but his personal integrity remained intact. The chivalric code that he lived by was dying on the battlefields of the 100 Years' War, replaced by pragmatism. His death marked the end of an era where kings were expected to be the bravest knights in the army. Today, the battlefield of Maupertuis is quiet, with only monuments and markers to indicate where the slaughter took place. The vineyards still grow on the rolling hills, and the mist still rises from the earth on cool September mornings. It is difficult to imagine the screams of men and horses and the whistling of arrows that once filled this peaceful landscape. Yet the history of the place remains etched in the memory of both England and France. It serves as a somber reminder of the cost of war and the fragility of power. The Battle of Poitiers stands as a testament to the unpredictable nature of warfare, where hubris can lead to ruin. It showed that technology and tactics could topple the established social order of the medieval world. The English longbow, a simple weapon of wood and string, brought the proudest knights of Europe to their knees. The victory of the Black Prince was a triumph of strategy over brute force and discipline over arrogance. It remains one of the most compelling and dramatic chapters in the long and bloody history of the Middle Ages. As we look back on the events of 1356, we see the beginning of the end for the feudal system. The reliance on common archers shifted power away from the aristocracy and hinted at the rise of national armies. The sheer scale of the English victory at Poitiers forced a reevaluation of how wars were fought and won. It was a harsh lesson for France, but one that would eventually help them forge a more modern and unified state. The echoes of that September day still resonate in the identity and history of the two nations. The story of Poitiers is also a human story of courage, fear, and the desperate struggle for survival. It is the story of the archer standing his ground against a charging horse and the king fighting to the last. It is the story of the Black Prince gambling everything on a single day and emerging victorious against all odds. These individual moments of heroism and tragedy weave together to form the tapestry of history. They remind us that the grand movements of nations are driven by the actions of men on the field. Ultimately, the Battle of Poitiers did not end the 100 Years' War, which would continue to ebb and flow for decades. The English gains would eventually be reversed by the resurgent French under capable leaders like Charles V and Joan of Arc. However, the battle remains a high water mark of English military power on the continent. It is a moment frozen in time when the Longbow ruled the battlefield and the Black Prince was invincible. It serves as a defining image of the medieval era in all its glory and brutality. The legacy of the battle is preserved in the chronicles of Jean Froissart and other historians who recorded the deeds of that day. Their writings allow us to glimpse the mindset of the medieval warrior and the values that drove them to fight. We see the importance of honor, ransom, and reputation in the conduct of war during the 14th century. These accounts provide a bridge to the past, helping us understand a world that is vastly different from our own. They ensure that the men who fought and died at Poitiers are not forgotten. In the end, the Battle of Poitiers serves as a powerful reminder that history is not determined by inevitable forces, but by choices. The choice of the Black Prince to stand and fight, and the choice of King John to attack changed the world. It is a story of how a small band of determined men can alter the destiny of empires. The dominance of the English longbow at Poitiers remains a symbol of innovation overcoming tradition. It is a whisper of time that speaks of valor, strategy, and the enduring nature of conflict.